Paranjoy Guha Thakurta is here, long-time friend, colleague. I don't know if I should also say that he's been a guiding spirit for me, sometimes inspiring me, and a colleague, partner in arms at times. Paranjoy, please come, take your place. I look forward to you. Because for many of the people here, it's a particularly heartening occasion for me, because this is the last of this is the 7th event on this book in Delhi. And I'm really surprised that so many people who are close to me, whom I know, who I've been in touch, who I meet, and many of them very distinguished people, diplomats, people like Ambassador Vijay Nambiar, Ambassador Dev Mukherjee, and colleagues like Anand Sahai, Nalin Ranjan, Mahendra Ved, so many of these people, but that I have not been able to have them, and somehow the timing has not matched their convenience to come. So this is a very, very heartening occasion for me. And now, our promising young scholar who I'm meeting for the first time, but I've heard a lot about him and his work on China, Dr. Arvind Yeleri. Can you please come and join us for the discussion? Come. Okay, I shall now hand over the proceedings to Professor Madhu Kalla.
Thank you very much for, first of all, asking me to chair the session. I don't normally chair sessions. I prefer to sort of speak at them, because controlling my panel is something that I find extremely undemocratic. Because sometimes they have so many good things to say, so cutting them off is very difficult for me. But thank you very much for asking me to chair the session. And I must say that I read the book cover to cover and enjoyed reading it. Reason being that, in one sense, the book has a breadth and scope. Can you hear me? Okay. Now, can you hear me now?
Yes. Now, yeah.
All right. So the book has a breadth and scope that is quite, shall we say, interesting, because in one sense it takes from the author's expertise, his experience, his perspectives, and it speaks directly to the reader. This is not something you come across in academic work, where a lot of research is in the archives or in documents, etc., etc. So in a sense, it's a very, the book is, it's sort of, there is no barrier between the author and the subject in this book. And what you get is a very personal view of events in China, a very insightful view at times of the narrative that the Chinese themselves have been creating about themselves, their policies and events in China. And one thing that you will notice when you read the book is that Shastri's collection of articles spans a particular period of time in which very many interesting things were happening. China was coming out of poverty, China was changing its northwest policy, development policy. China was actually engaging in economic and social engineering in Tibet. It was also, and at the heart of what was happening in the debates in China was also the fallouts of all the policies that China had been undertaking in this period. So in a sense, you get from the book both the successes of China as well as the concerns within China about the fallout of its policies. And that I found very interesting, because it sort of balances off. I mean, we generally get to hear about China either the successes or the critique of China. From the West, you get the critique of China, China is going to collapse. From China itself, you get a narrative about its successes. But here you have a pretty much a balanced picture about what China is doing over this span of time, and and as well, of course, what are the problems that China is confronting. So in that sense, I think it's one of those few books that is pretty much balanced in terms of its perspectives on China. The other thing, of course, is that given the breadth and scope of the book, a large part, the first part of it is really about domestic policies. And what that does for us, I think, in many ways, it gives us a perspective of what is happening in China, which becomes a basis for us to think about China. I think thinking about China in this country specifically is really based on TV narratives, on headlines in newspapers, on crises that emerge sporadically, about fear, about anxiety. And very little of our understanding has to do with what is happening within China and the complexity of the debates within China. So in one sense, I think a focus on domestic events, domestic policies, domestic debates brings China alive to the reader in ways in which they don't ordinarily come alive in this very kind of black and white narrative that we have concocted over the years, both in the media as well as in our popular op-ed pieces. And fighting against that in India is very difficult. If you were to write a considered piece on China, nobody will publish this in a newspaper. Everybody wants an opinion about how we can deal with China. And the way to deal with China is to first perhaps understand what China is going through. So in one sense, I think, therefore, Shastri's book brings that home to us in large measure. The other thing, of course, that I really want to say in introduction, and I will leave this to my panelists, is, there's a thread that runs through the book about what we can learn from China, right? And it seems to me that in this entire narrative in the book, what we can learn from China, ultimately we can conclude that what we can learn from China is to be innovative in terms of our policies, to be open in terms of our policies, and to be nimble in terms of our thinking. Right? Both in terms, and this comes through in Shastri's, discussion on our neighborhood and how we deal with our neighborhood, and how China deals with our neighborhood, right? But I think underlying the entire thrust of the book is the fact that we have no trust in China. We don't trust each other. Okay, there is a whole new area of research on trust in international relations. It's something quite recent, and clearly there is an understanding that trust is the basis of any kind of a peaceful relationship. So if we don't have trust in China, perhaps we should begin to look at how to create this trust. Increasingly, I think our neighbors don't have trust in us. Our neighborhood doesn't have trust in us. Pakistan doesn't trust us. Nepal doesn't trust us. Myanmar doesn't trust us. Bangladesh just about barely trusts us. So what is the element of trust that we can be dealing with here, right? How do we create trust with our neighbors? How do we create trust with China, which is also our neighbor, right? And I think we need to think seriously, both in the academy, as well as in the media, as well as broadly, I think, in our ecosystem, about what trust means and how to create trust. What are the elements of trust that we need to create? But I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to ask, perhaps, Pranay to...
That is a more illustrious media personality. Thank you so much, Dr. Madhu Bhalla. Thank you, Shastri. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I am the ignoramus in this group. I am the layperson. And Shastri was categorical. He literally coerced me, twisted my arm, and he said, you have to be there. Precisely because I've had enough discussions with specialists on China. I've been a generalist journalist focusing on the political economy of India and the world, so I had to know what was going on in China. a little bit at least, or pretend to know a little bit. I must also confess that I spent all of a week on one occasion at the largest urban agglomeration of the People's Republic of China, which is at the southernmost part of the country. It is, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember correctly, the sixth most populous city in the People's Republic of China. It's a place called Kunming, and it's a very popular tourist spot within China because it's called the land of eternal spring. It's neither too cold nor too hot. And for the first time I experienced what was happening. I was part of a delegation which was called the Kolkata to Kunming project. And for the first time I realized that the distance between Kolkata and Kunming is more or less the same as the distance between Kolkata and Delhi, and less than Kolkata and Mumbai. Because unlike when you travel, say, to Bangladesh, to Dhaka, you have to go past the chicken's neck. You fly straight across Bangladesh, and never before have I seen such a spectacular view of the Loktak Lake in Manipur when I saw it from the top of the sky. It was an amazing experience, but I can't say I know anything about China, except from what I've read in newspapers, magazines, Shastri's articles included. So you will excuse me if I speak from the perspective of a layperson. I agree with what Dr. Bhalla said right at the beginning. You know, Shastri is a journalist. He's not an academic, but he has also been an academic. And I dare say, if I can turn around the cover title, the difference between academia and journalism is sometimes a false binary. You know, just because you have footnotes and you have literature reviews, it doesn't necessarily make all so-called scholarly work into work that is very much more significant or better than what journalists on the run, journalists on the move have to churn out on a regular basis. So this particular book is a collection of what Shastri has been writing.
One second. No, that is a mistake. It is not a compilation or a collection of my writings.
Okay.
It is based on the large body of material I gathered and also what I had written. As one of the reviewers who is a faculty member at Jindal, Uttaranda Gupta had said, like if I had written something in 2008 or 9, then I draw the line from there to now, where that process has come.
Okay.
So this relates to that period, and I have drawn on my writings also. Sorry.
Right, no, I stand corrected.
No, the mistake is mine in the way I have written in the author's note. I'm sorry.
No, it's not a mistake. It is drawn on several articles that he wrote, but it is not a sort of simple, compilation of articles with dates and a little introduction and a little conclusion to contextualize the work. But yes, there were articles and essays and work that he wrote and writings of significance about India-China between 2008 and 2022. And he doesn't call it an epilogue, but the last part of the book, which is called One Mountain, Two Tigers, that part was written on the 24th of October last year. So it's not even been a year. So in that sense, the book is extremely topical. And like a good journalist that Shastri is, he knows how he has to hook the reader, how he has to attract the attention of the reader. So a good headline, a catchy headline, a good introduction, and what follows. But that is one of the strong points of the book. And because he's a journalist, I personally, and because I'm a journalist too, I found the most fascinating parts of the book were the nuanced view he took of the media in India and the media in the People's Republic of China. And because he has worked there. And many of the notions that he had about how the media is supposed to be working here and how the media works there are debunked. And in fact, he highlights a lot of the similarities, but without papering over the differences. And it's filled with excellent anecdotes. And these anecdotes are not anecdotes because they are the subject matter of a newspaper article, but because they point to bigger issues, social, economic, and political issues. Say, the case of corruption of Bo. My Mandarin is pathetic, so you will excuse me if I mispronounce several names. The curious closure of a school in Beijing, which was in the Indian embassy, when our present External Affairs Minister was heading the Indian embassy in Beijing. Am I correct? Yeah. So these anecdotes and they weave together and put together a bigger narrative of what's happening between India and China. At the risk of stating the very, very obvious things, and has been said, but much has been said about the Asian century, etc. Ma'am, please tell me when I should finish. How many minutes?
That's my problem. Yes.
5 minutes? 10 minutes. Oh, you're very kind. So let's talk about this great Asian century, which we are sort of waiting for still. And yes, the two most populous countries on planet Earth, these two countries together would account for around 40% of the population of the planet. And surely these are two countries and their similarities and differences would make a huge difference to what's going to happen to the world around us. There's no dispute about that. There are several differences, including the economy, the political systems, the demographic profile. India's median age is 28, 29. Demographers have different points of view. China's median age is 38, 39. Shastri has written a lot on the one-child policy followed by the two-child policy and the three-child policy in the bigger context of what these demographic profiles mean for China's economy. He's dwelt at considerable length on the way the political systems of the two countries work, their similarities and their differences. If I may, with your permission, madam, two short extracts I want to read, 2 paragraphs from the book, just to give people here a flavor of what this book is. Yes, there are parts which are re-emphasized, sometimes repeated over and again for emphasis. This is right, these are 2 paragraphs right from the beginning. At 60, Beijing had little to worry about beyond its borders. Nothing foreign could hinder China's global advance. The challenges were essentially internal. There had been hundreds of thousands of quote-unquote mass incidents, minor riots, social upheavals, demonstrations, and protests across China in recent years. These mass incidents, not making headlines abroad, like riots in Tibet or Xinjiang, signified the seething discontent of those uprooted or left behind by development, the deprived and the dispossessed. This was the flip side of rapid economic growth, appalling income disparities, rising unemployment, displacement of rural populations, pervasive corruption, criminality, massive environmental degradations, pockets of extreme poverty, social sickness, discontent of the have-nots, and restive minorities in the Tibet and Xinjiang regions. Just remove those names, Tibet, Xinjiang, Beijing, China, and the narrative is all too familiar, perhaps a little too familiar for those of us in this country. So, what Shastri has done, he's not pulled his punches. He's mentioned, like a good journalist, what it is, what it has been like, and what it is to. He begins his book with the how if you go to Beijing and the malls there, you can get just about everything you can hope to get in Paris or London or any European capital. And he starts there. But then he explains all these aspects. The other paragraph is looking at the political system. Again, you are looking at, he makes these cross-border comparisons. Page 25. It may be argued that China, like many Arab countries, including Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, has an authoritarian political order. True, but all dictatorships are not alike. Neither are all democracies. Doubtless, China is a dictatorship. It is the dictatorship of the Communist Party. Unlike most Arab dictators who were and are propped up by external powers, mainly the United States and after the sun set on the British Empire, for securing their own strategic security, political and economic interests. In sharp contrast, the Chinese instrument of dictatorship is a revolutionary product of its own people and their nationalism. Now you can quibble with that last line, but all that has preceded before it, there's no disagreement. You may have a completely different opinion on the quote-unquote revolutionary product. So, so this book gives you a range of opinions, a range of views. I was particularly interested not just in the political, or not just in the way Shastri has dealt with how the media works. He has himself worked in several of the major publications over there. He's also talked a lot about the economy. Now we all know, yes, in terms of per capita income, where China is, GDP 4 times higher, and we started more or less at the same place in the early 80s, the two countries. But he's also taken a far more nuanced view about why it is important to engage with China at an economic level. And it's not just important, it is a necessity, it has to happen. I mean, just a few random examples. India's pharmaceutical industry, which is supposed to be one of the best or one of the leading industries in the world, almost all of its raw materials, they're called APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, come from China. So it doesn't matter if in a fit of pique you say, oh, TikTok banned. I mean, you surely don't want to close down all the pharmaceutical companies, including the ones in Gujarat. So he does talk a lot about that. Say our automotive industry, from two-wheelers to heavy vehicles. The amount of Chinese components in the automotive sector is incredible. So these are among various important issues which Shastri's book talks about. And above all, he is very nuanced in his view, and therefore he traces all the incursions from April 2013 to as recent as 2020, and looks at all these disputes, all the issues in great detail. So whether the Asian century, as he asks, is going to be an illusion of our times or reality, is something we still have to wait and watch. I mean, in several respects, India's economy is far more fragile, far more vulnerable, far more prone to shocks than China. I mean, he says India and China were among the two countries in the world which weathered the recession of the Great Recession of 2008. I would disagree with him. I think China weathered it far better than India. There were other countries who did. So, I mean, one can have disputes or disagreements with some of his positions, but he has touched on all the issues, provided all the facts, and then it's up to you to arrive at a considered opinion on whether what Shastri has written, how important it is. And the important thing is he is not, his opinions are always nuanced. It's not that my way or the highway. He provides you a range of views and then says, okay, this is an opinion that comes. So yes, I should stop here and say that all those who are interested in the world's two most populous countries should go through this book. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
It's a privilege to be here, especially in front of my teacher and very well-known journalist like Shastri and comment on his book. I will be as brief as possible and try to keep my comments as crisp. First of all, there is a saying, that if you go to China for 1 day or 2 days, you will end up writing a beautiful article. And if you live in China for a month, you will end up writing a very interesting book. But if you live in China beyond 1 month, you will get further miffed, confused, because you'll be excited to know more. And let me congratulate Shastri that he has proven everybody wrong. Despite coming in and out, visiting China on several occasions, he has produced a really remarkable work. And like my teacher said, she read cover to cover. I also went page by page, cover to cover, and I found it really interesting. What is most striking about the book is the optics. Since most of you are reading China from different sources, most of you reading from non-academic sources, because most of the times, as it is referred, we unnecessarily burden readers with footnotes, references, which maybe create some kind of allergy to read China in a very connected form. And as a result of it, books like this, with a rest of references, but coming most from the primary experiences, proves quite critical for readers. As a reason, the optics is very important here. And when I say optics, I want to use one metaphor over here. When you talk about optics, when you talk about a camera, when you talk about lenses, since Shastri is talking about binaries, I take this metaphor about having a camera with wide lens and lengthened exposure. When you have a good eyesight, you have a good optics, a good camera with wide lens, and you let your reel expose for longer, you create the granular details of a picture. That's the difference. But against that, when you have a high shutter speed, you do not capture the details, but you capture the actions. So what this book is unique for is the difference between action and phenomenon. So Shastri in past several years had let his lens wide, be exposed to all the inputs, all the readings, because of which most of his writings throughout the book has been very objective and absolutely granular. So what is the difference between a writer and a cameraman is because cameraman is capturing an action which is momentous or momentary. But authors like Shastri wait, delve, get immersed, and write and bring out a work which is more immersive. For example, when you look at the range of topics he has touched upon, I'm very sure for the first time when Shastri went to China, I'm very sure he never thought that he will end up writing a book. Right? I'm sure. I don't think when you went to China for the first time you thought that you would end up writing a book. And maybe whatever he wrote after that was absolutely objective and contemporary. And maybe he thought that there is a lack of literature and he should come up with a book, and that's the reason there is originality. A book is written by an author sometimes with a bias and a framework that I will write about this thing in the next 10 months, 12 months, I'll publish from a publisher and it will reach to readers. But that's where the originality comes from. He did not, I'm sure, that view that this is going to be a book 2 decades later. That's one factor which brings in a lot of originality. So the difference between the optics he has used, the actions he has left but occupied the phenomenon is something very drastic which makes it very. Some of the intermittent connections he has been making in the book, for example, party to politics, consumers to malls, individual to being people and citizens, people to households, fashion to trends. These interconnections and connecting the points is an important for any book, and as an author, I think he has proved that he could connect these dots flawlessly. There are 2 important things I think more than the book is important for. The first one is, as Madhunan said correctly, if you look at this 2 decades span, from 2007 when China's growth rates was double-digit 14.89%, and where it stands today. And what happened in between from 2008 onwards, he was being nominated as Vice President, President Xi, then he was given charge of prepare a program list for the opening of China's reforms, and then Xi Jinping did that very diligently, and then he was looking at China's falling growth rate, China's falling prestige, China's weakening economic power. So China, what it was in 2008 and what it is today is absolutely different. And then there was a time when most of us used to read book about China's power, wealth, might. End up discussing about now where that all has gone. And most of the review readers cannot even make a connection. China, which turned out to be a manufacturing hub, a locomotive of growth, and where China stands. So you had a big void there, and you wanted to have a book, a literature, which will give you, an absolute access to the Forbidden City, and it explains you why it happened actually. The one interesting case about closing down the Indian Embassy School in 2011 is, I think, where he talks about why it was necessary even to close down, and the kids of the Indian diplomats or the South Asian diplomats preferred or maybe thought of going to the Pakistani embassy school. We were losing something unconsciously, or maybe it was planned, I don't know, but he puts it very, very succinctly. He said that this decision was taken, it wouldn't have been possible without the signature of the predecessor, the former ambassador Nibamaro. So the details he brings out, and with the small nuances, it's absolutely remarkable. And I read the book, not as an academician, I read the book as a student, as a reader. And let me tell you, the first interface of any researcher and a student to his area and study is newspaper and media. We read you, we follow you, and from there we derive our own understanding and decide, wow, this is something amazing. Can I read more about this? Can I read more about this? And then we get into or dwell into academics. So our journey starts from where Shastri starts writing or where he starts discussing. So in that sense, this book is really important. The last point I want to bring out why this book is important is while India is trying to understand China, why I'm saying present continuous tense, because it's a big country and we have to objectively accept that we need to understand more of China to better be prepared for all eventualities and eventualities, right? And while India is looking at China, it's trying to prepare its bandwidth, capacities, policy making, processes, understanding it. What is most important for us and what we have been doing is actually, practically, we are not copying from China, but we are learning from mistakes China made. And that is the most important thing for India. We should learn from the mistakes China made, and we should unlearn what what we have read, what we had biases about China. That's an important distinction and departure for anybody who's looking at China, for that matter. So while we develop these capacities and understand how India should look at China, the books like this are really handy. They really help you, like, you know, a modern gadget like a remote control. Keep changing channel. Okay, this is there, this is there. Okay, I want to see something else quickly. And this is important now if you put it into the optics again. My first point, what is that larger optics? It is not important now only that how India is looking at China, but rest of the world is looking at China, how we are dealing China. Now, if you put that, if you take that larger context, that India looking into China is important, but the rest of the world is looking at how India is developing its China policies, its China capacities, then you understand that, okay, this is a treasure. And I'm actually promoting the book. This is a real treasure. You want to really read a book which is minus the references, more coming from the heart and the strong feeling. This is something really interesting. And the way he puts, the way he explains, you know, tier 1 China Daily, tier 2 Xinhua, tier 3 Global Times. And then he explains why. He brings out all those nuances about China, not only in terms of how China has developed it, but giving you the reason. So the difference between knowledge and wisdom is the difference between why and how, right? So that is where I think he's trying to bridge the gap. And I think, let me congratulate Shastri once again. This is really a good book for an academician like me. And I really learned, and when I finished the book, I developed a lot of interest again to go back to my readings and try to see that, oh, this is something which I left out, because sometimes what happens, academicians, we tend to develop super specialities, right? And in the process of developing super specialities, you may lose touch, right, with the other granular details. So thank you so much for inviting me, and congratulations to you once again.
So, as you can see, my fellow panelists have, placed the book in perspective, and the perspective is, it's very useful for us to be looking at. But I would like to, at this point, ask you to say a few words about the book, and then open the floor to questions.
Thank you, Professor Madhubala. In very soft, understated tone, she has said that I should speak a few words. I shall speak a few words. First and foremost, today is a particularly happy occasion for me, because the only one who collaborated with me on the book, she is here. She was here for the first function, is Bihu Chaudia, and she's the one who kind of sexualized it and everything. And actually, she inspired me to do the kind of work I did. I didn't even remember many of the contents what I had written 15 years ago, and so on. And I had 2, 3, 4 people before I did this thing who wanted to collaborate. They opted out, they said it is this, it is that, will you say this about Xi Jinping, will you say this about me? I said none of that is the issue to decide. We look at this material and we go with what it is. It is neither, we don't have any preconceptions of who should be offended or who should be pleased, and that kind of consideration at all. And I did everything to discourage her. She's a very young Chinese enthusiast. She did her Chinese studies from JNU and then international relations from Central European University in Austria. And so I told her there is no money in this, there is no future. In spite of all that, she insisted on doing this. She refused to be discouraged, by all that I said, and a lot of the work. So this was really a huge source of support for her. And the most important consideration was, I feel vindicated again, is not in any way to kind of diminish the importance of the high priestesses of Chinese scholarship and study in India, like Professor Madhu Valla and the Institute of Chinese Studies. All these people who have commended my work, but I want my book to be read by people of her age who are in their 20s. I want that they who will look up to and listen to people like Arvind Deleri will read this book. Otherwise, there is no future for a large Indian population to understand China, which is what is very, very important. It is really extraordinary how little we know about China. And every time I sit in a discussion like this, it is brought home to me the large sections of life in China which my book has not touched. You find it a lot, but I find it, I'm become acutely conscious of how little is it. Okay, there is nothing about science and technology in China. There is nothing with my friend Vijay Vishra tells me periodically. There is nothing about sports and cultural modes and sexual modes. And China, when I first went... Food? Modes. Food. Yeah, food is very important. And when except I think somebody like Anand Krishna of the Hindu who was there, and I don't know about people like Ambassador Nambiar and all who have great insights and understanding and familiarity with a lot of things Chinese. But most Indians there couldn't even find all the Chinese places. They say, oh, there are so many Chinese restaurants. It took a young American scholar. I was editing a book he had translated on Chinese intellectual history some 300-400 years ago. So then he said, Shastri, because I don't hear well, so I can't grasp certain nuances of language and tones and all that. So he said, no, you tell me, I'll come to your area, see what kind of restaurants are there, and tell you where you can go. So I asked him, but why are there so many restaurants? Just let's take a hub like Meherchand Market. You will find in every such hub, there will be a restaurant representative of every province in China. The person from that province, he will want to go to that place. So there are some 30-40 places. For us, they are all Chinese, you know. So everything, one of the first things I learned was, no, it is not Chinese food. We have to break this monolith of Chinese food, of a single communist party, of a totally controlled media. That unless one breaks this down and refuses to see it like that, one cannot see what is happening. And almost always, with the exception of Hindu Ramakrishnan, who knew Chinese, who was very much involved in it, and it was almost all Westerners to whom I discovered large parts of China, especially Americans. In fact, the largest number of expats there who are professionals who are working are Americans. I don't see why it shouldn't be Indians. There are more than 200 Americans when I was there, out of the 450 or 60 people, foreigners working in Sinhua. And they all want British English. In fact, I'm told that the Chinese have taken great interest in sustaining the, what do you call that, those call centers around in the Philippines, because they feel that more and more people who have accentless English, like from Canada, UK and so on, they are all disappearing and they have made an effort to sustain it. I feel all this could have been areas for India to intervene and sustain, given our early influence in Indo-China and so on. So one is food. The other thing which Paranjoy mentioned is very, very interesting. Is he mentioned about the distance between Kunming and Calcutta. They are really close. You take a flight, you are there in 2 hours. You come back from there, you are here at the same time that you left there. And when I went to Kunming, I discovered something, that there is a lot of India-China, what might call, there is a non-formal sector. Just like people used to write very casually, oh, the border trade between Punjab and Pakistan is more than 1,200 crores in alcohol. So why is it difficult to improve the relationship between the two countries? But unlike that, here, I found that when I went to the Kunming airport, there was a long line of people with trolleys right up to the top. Packages. So I asked them, what is this? They said, no, you can go and this. There's people doing Hindi. So they said, nahi, aap le jaiye, aapke paas kitna hai, you have lot of luggage. No, I said, they said, no, can you take some for us, 5 kgs, 10 kgs? We've kept all these parcels here. So, who are these people? These are the business travelers who have sustained India and China on a business track. Who are these young business travelers, half educated? They are the people who have shops in the Kidarpur market in Calcutta. And they have, every flight, there are about 30-35 of them who go. Somebody buys their tickets in block for them. They had paid 11,000 rupees as against the 19,000 that was the fare for which I had traveled. And so they go there, they go by today's flight, come back if possible the same, or they stay there. I asked them, do you speak Chinese? They said, no, no. But I could see that they could speak Chinese. When I asked them, what about your food here? They said, oh, there is no place in the world where there is no Bangladeshi kitchen. So there are a lot of these Bangladeshis, they have a room and they have a kitchen. So if you have to stay overnight, you stay there. They were paid about 4,500 rupees a day, plus their fare, to bring back the permissible 35 kgs of food. So what were the food? They were bringing t-shirts. I asked them how much of these t-shirts. These t-shirts were 100 rupees then, in 2014 or whatever. And then they said, even if you sell it at 78 rupees, we still have 3 rupees clean profit. So where do these come from? These come by these fast trains from Guangzhou to Kunming. And they come as cargo in these trains. And then they are brought to these places, they are kind of unloaded and then broken down into small units. So when I met Pranab Mukherjee in Manipal, I was also invited for a discussion on China. And I liked a lot of things that Mr. Pranab Mukherjee had said about China. One of the important points which he made was that unless India and China join hands, you cannot address the disparity within Asia. And unless you address the disparity within Asia, between its poorer quarters, like ASEAN, we all think of Singapore and Malaysia and Bangkok, but ASEAN is also Cambodia, Laos and Vietnam. Unless this is done, there cannot be an Asian center. So I told him about this. He told me, no, no, don't write about this, don't make any documents, because that will also get struck there. And the second thing then that struck me was, there used to be a kind of forum which used to regularly have a discussion on what they call sub-regionalism, which was, I think, grew out of this Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar forum. So when I was in one of these things, then Mr. Pranab Mukherjee had said that, he said, we want peace on the periphery and progress and development at the center. So this was almost like saying that, okay, these border people, they have to be left to their own fate. Much like Jawaharlal Nehru said, my heart goes out to the people of Northeast, but we want progress, so they have to be molded and sustained in a way to cater to the interest of the center. So then he said, he didn't mean that. But why I mentioned these two things is that the people who live on the borders of Bangladesh, China, India and Myanmar, they probably have more in common with each other. Seasons, habitat, food, cultural practices, perhaps even a language of their own. Had something like that been sustained, probably we would have moved closer towards understanding those people. And the distance between those people is almost nil, whereas the distance is a huge yawning distance between Beijing and Rangoon or Dhaka and Beijing. That is not there. So, and one of the things which a lot of Chinese scholars, particularly Professor Patricia Oberoi, has been telling me, and which I find very, very surprising, that instead of hammering our head against this Belt and Road Initiative, why have we not spent more words and thought on this Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar forum, which might have revived a culture of at least parts of understanding that had been opened up and relationship. So this was first thing. The second thing then, the other thing is when you speak about science, technology and all, is that, of course, China is a military power. We have to hold our own against it. We cannot compromise. The fact that you travel with somebody doesn't mean you have to subject yourself to the authority or the domination of that person. So, any argument that are made or reasons or case for India-China relationship, it does not necessarily follow the one has to follow the other or bigger, or because China is stronger, you should not have it, they will give you. It's not necessary. India is dealing with a lot of stronger powers, and it has not lost its strategic autonomy in dealing with many of these people. But by not dealing with China, what we lose is a lot of things they have, including much more affordable technology. And China is also a technology power, it's also a knowledge power. So we are losing access to all these things. And if you reflect on, I think, some kind of a balance sheet, what we gain, what we lose in a relationship, the pros and cons, there is no such analysis made. Secondly, as a media person, I become acutely conscious of how much Indian media has failed Indians. And not just in the last 10 to 14 years, even before that. So, this whole perception of China, I remember a very senior civil servant who was posted abroad. His wife is also a very scholarly woman. The son was studying in modern school. So all these elite schools used to have these things of taking children on excursions to Singapore and all these places. And there used to be a huge scramble for that. So apparently one of the children was chosen and she said, no, how can he go? My husband is secretary so and so, why not our child? How did that person, we can't allow this thing, you know? So these are meant for, but I've never heard, they asked them, but do they go to Sri Lanka or China or Pakistan or, no. They say it won't even occur to us because we want to go to places which we think are aspirational like Singapore or Malaysia. But are they really aspirational in the sense that we want in terms of the cultural depth and diversity of India? These are questions we don't answer, they have not thought about. The third thing is that almost everything, except for what I have spoken to China, knowing people in India, in academics and in the diplomacy, in MEA, and people who travel there, it's almost what I have read from by Western writers and scholars, like Peter Hessler and Jonathan Spence. And the first book which I have read about 10 times or probably more, is Max Weber's Origins of China. You know? So if we read that, we can also see how China's transformation is so extraordinary. Like one of the things I can never forget is Max Weber saying that China, people are talking of an industry, and he was writing at a time when this kind of communication was not there. It was from travelers that he was getting his tales and all that. And I think even the book, Needham Science and Civilization, was not very widely read at that time. And he says that if China is to become an industrial power for an Asian country with Chinese culture being what it is, it requires an enormous transformation and a kind of a Protestant culture for an industrial level. So he almost ruled it out because this would not happen in 100 years. But it did happen in less than 50 years. So why did it happen? How did it happen? What were the impacts? These things were not studied. The last thing I want to say as a media person is that when I'm there, when I'm here also, I become acutely conscious of the media, especially when I work with television. Like one of my visits to Pakistan, I went to Pakistan and came back. So they asked me, can you do some ideas for a script? So I said, I have, but I don't know if it's a story for a script. They said, what is it? I said, I want to talk about newspapers in Pakistan. Almost every newspaper, English newspaper, of course again goes to a small, powerful elite, like in India, the English newspaper. They have 1 or 2 pages on Kashmir every day. There are people here who would know, who write about this. There are people like Mr. Saeed Naqvi who feature, who are big names in Pakistani media. So I said, this is one thing. I brought back those newspapers, I gave it to journalism schools here, they have this. Then every week, definitely on one day, if not on 2 days, there are 1, if not 2 pages on Bollywood gossip. They have far more Bollywood gossip in Pakistani newspapers than you have in Delhi newspapers. See? So you could learn a lot. Well, we have no such thing in the Indian newspaper. I mean, if you are a kind of a power, then the spaces that you have should be occupied by so-called lesser countries as we perceive them to be, but that is not the case here at all. So then the channel chief editor said, no, we don't have the viewership for this and we will lose whatever rating we have. It's only by Pakistan bashing that our rating will improve. So this is a given. So in course of time, this has transformed, this applies to China also. And to the way they write about China, like for instance, you will find we will never describe George Bush as a former CIA spook or a director, but we'll always describe Putin as a former KGB agent. So these biases, which have been ingested into us by Western, even scholarship, media and all that, these will be. And there was a defense minister who has recently been disgraced in China and has disappeared practically. Every report I remember in India used to begin with that the US sanctioned defense minister. But why don't we look at our neighbors for what they are instead of the tags that other countries have given to them? But it is surprising that the US has a vast scholarship on China, the number of journals they have, the people they have working in China who know Mandarin, who are living there, their trade, their interact, everything is booming. Here we don't have that, and we have picked up the worst that we can of Western, what shall I say, cultural reproductions of China and media reproductions of China, like we have of all other countries. The third and last thing I would like to say, that one of the things which I find extremely appalling about Indian media, particularly now, is where reporting foreign affairs is not even kind of just declined to diplomacy as it had done before 15, 20, but it is declined to just a single personality and the focus on and every act of a person. It's like, giving a calendar of events. There is no depth, no insight, nothing. That is fine. If that is what the people want to be fed on, that is how they are going to compete with these kind of flat programs on television. That's how the market helps them to survive, fine. But what is worse is that Indian media is with gleeful kind of enthusiasm, they will defame and slander every developing country whenever there is any output from the West. If we say that Fatah has said something about Pakistan, you will find especially TV channels, they will go at it day after day. Same thing anything said about China. But I found that neither in Pakistan nor in China do they pick up these tropes from the Western media to defame any developing country. So there is in that sense absolutely no kind of elementary consciousness of what is called even G20, or what I would say is a southern view of our fellow neighbors and countries in the southern hemisphere. So this is something whereas in China, I found, and with this last part of it, is that China today is like what the US and the Soviet Union was in the 60s and the 70s. They are getting people in droves from all countries, like in the 60s and 70s, and maybe even early 80s. A lot of Indians used to go from various sections. They used to be invited on various programs. They used to be shown, oh, you see what industries Americans have, what heavy industry Russia has. Their media is developed, they have this, they have that. They were all exposed to what you call development, progress. Now it is China that has the funds and that is doing it. And there are so many areas one can research. Like I learned that there were more than 35,000 Peruvians, most of them in Beijing alone. And there are people from almost all the South American countries. And anyone who's been to Beijing, perhaps I've come across people who come back to Beijing from Hong Kong, from Tokyo, from Mongolia, where they have all these Western English teachers, because English teaching is a big pathway to enter into China, whatever else you may do. And they all say no. We find Beijing is perhaps the only truly global city. Because you go to a small place like Connaught Place, and its name has changed now, you will find 100 eateries there from almost every other country in the world. You don't have anything like that in India. So there is, every time I come, I become acutely conscious when I hear Paranjoy, when I hear Arvind or Prasad, of the enormous amount of area left out of any kind of observation, inquiry, exploration, or research. And I would say, if this happens, perhaps in 20 years, in 25 years, we will at least know that China is not just a monolith behind the wall, and it is not what you call inscrutable and so on. Thank you for the time.
Thank you. It's always interesting to hear how a book got written and what's behind the writing of a book. So thank you very much for that. Can we open the floor to questions, please? Please. Oh, can you get a mic, please? Yes, mic.
The element of trust was mentioned. Now, why is it that the trust between India and China has gone down so much? Considering that we have so much trade between us, considering that there has been no armed conflict since 1962 for all purposes. Even Galan was basically a mistake on both sides. Fault was entirely Chinese, of course. So, how do we get over this lack of this? And why is China so aggressive on the border if its intention is not to attack? What are they trying to prove? You know, and of course, we must agree that Chinese are weaponizing different countries, and to that extent they promote conflict. But they themselves have not undertaken any armed conflict. And so why are we, so I think PM Modi is doing the right thing by increasing economic interaction and of course defending our borders, but without any conflict.
Take your short answer. Okay. No, first, I do not want to get into a discussion of the merits and demerits of who is right and wrong, who is aggressive, who is not aggressive. Because when it comes to any armed conflicts on the border, generally the position taken is my country right or wrong. And no matter how we frame this question, there's a kind of this nationalist chill that comes into it, so I don't want to get into that. But recently, there was an article in the Times of India, written by India's former Foreign Secretary and Ambassador to China, Mr. Vijay Gokhale, which had a heading, which I hope everybody at least read the heading, even if not the article. He said, keep your enemy closer. See, if you don't talk, you say, yes, oh, we should not talk to them unless it's border. If you don't talk, the dangers are greater than the risks of what talking might do. Not talking is not a solution. But then, again, this is a case of where Indian media has failed. I don't expect Indian academia to take it up because people say, who are these people to tell us how we should deal with China? And even media doesn't point it out. You look at the kind of hostility that is perceived and projected and pervaded between China and Japan and India. But I have never seen a single report in the Indian media of how many times China and Japan meet every year. There is a Tokyo Forum, there is a Beijing Forum, there is a Bao Forum. So you have these forums between Japan and China, and you have forums which involve Japan, China, and South Korea. We don't have any such forum. In fact, we have killed one forum which was there, SARC. Then BIMSTEC has also got vitiated. And now we are carrying this India-Pakistani hostility into this SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So we should move beyond targeting our neighbors, whatever the tropes we use for it, whether it is terrorism or whatever it might be, or military conflict. So that is how I would see it. Then why don't you talk? The US has been China's biggest ideological, cultural, political and economic enemy, okay, as we see it. Why is US talking more to China than us? Every year, after the Shangri-La dialogue, where you will have the Admiral of the Pacific will come and talk very strong words, oh, we have to contain China in the South China Sea. These are pro forma statements. We will exaggerate it like here. China slammed by all the Shangri-La dialogue. 1 week later, there is a US-China security and economic dialogue where the Secretary of State and the Treasury Secretary spent 3 days in Beijing discussing their cooperation. And I have never seen this reported here. So I find that we are missing a lot of developments because we are focused on a particular, and whatever happens, even if there is a conflict, you look at what we did in Maldives. You know, somebody said on Twitter, 70 crore Indians, they are opposed to Maldives. 70 crore Indians, have they heard of Maldives? How can you have foreign policy that is decided by trolls on social media? See? And slowly, the trolling is becoming respectable also. So, I would again say that Vijay Gokhale's speech has got a lot of that. Then he said, you talk to your enemy, keep your enemy closer. You know? So, I think we should, and in my book also I have said this, that we should do what the US does in the way it deals with China. We should not do what the US tells us to do. And the US is telling us to do. And the most telling example of how they tell us is what happened 2 weeks ago in Dharamshala. You have a bunch of senators who have come, led by Nancy Pelosi, whose husband is a big investor in semiconductor chips in Taiwan. They have passed a resolution in the US Congress that Tibet should have freedom. This is decided in the US. Of course, the US Congress has been giving 25 million on record by a resolution to the Tibetan movement and the government here. And they are not supposed to indulge in any politics, whether it is for India or for China or against China. So you had these senators who went there. The Indian foreign minister was there. He hosted a dinner for them. After that, they came to Delhi and they met the Prime Minister. And already you had another delegation led by Jake Sullivan, who was a US National Security Advisor. No. And then I found that all of us, who any day ideologically our affinities are towards Washington, not towards Beijing, they raised this question. Is like the voice that was most conspicuous on this was Suhasini Haidar in the Hindu. She said, is this India's voice on this thing? And the Dalai Lama was anyway going to the US for medical treatment a few days later. Till today, except for that one piece by Suhasini Haidar, which raises this question of whether is this India's voice, and she said this does not make us stronger, this makes us weaker. So you do not become weak by talking to China, but you definitely weaken yourself by letting the Americans or any other foreign country come into your territory and tell them a group that we want you to fight for your freedom in another country. I think, so if we ask these questions, we have to not be deflected by their being told, just look at the border, look at the conflict, they are aggressive, this kind of thing. That is my perception of it. Mike? Pass the mic.
Thank you. Actually, I have two small points of queries. First is that like Chinese cuisine is very popular in India. We always talk of Chinese cuisine. Everybody knows about it. And we have Chinese eateries that we have on pan-India basis. Do we have a similar importance given to Indian cuisine, or is it talked about or given some importance in China? And secondly, like I don't understand this contradiction. Like nowadays we say that China is on the decline, or like you said that 2007-8 it was going exponentially, a very 14% or whatever, and we were just growing at 7 or 8%. And after that, now we say that India is the fastest growing economy and China is on decline. Comparatively, their growth rate has slowed down. But actually, I feel that China is a developed country. For all practical purposes, China is a developed country, while we are still a developing country. And our GDP, what we say fifth largest, is hardly 3.75 trillion USD, while China's is 19 trillion USD. So it's almost 5 times per capita income is. And we have overtaken in terms of population, which is a, bad thing to happen as largest, most populous country. So all the parameters, China is still a great power, and secondly, we criticize BRI as a debt trap for the countries who signed up for BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. So I see a contradiction, maybe because for geopolitical reasons China is aggressive and they have disputes with different countries in the South China Sea and or whatever neighboring countries. But still China is a great power. So why we say that China is on the decline while India is on the rise? I don't understand this contradiction, because it's like a PLC, product life cycle. When India will also go for 2047 or 2050, around the growth rate or GDP which China today has. So then India will also decline. Our median population will be 40 years today with 30, 20, 10 years gap is there. Thank you.
May I take the first part, first question?
Please, yes.
I think this is the point that Shastri has made, though it's not there very much in the book. As soon as you say Chinese cuisine, I have to ask you, what is Indian cuisine? Is there Indian cuisine? Are you talking about Punjab or Bengal or Maharashtra, or you're talking about Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Kannada? Okay. The same aloo is made different ways, every 10 kilometers. The same dosa is made 100 times or 100 different ways. So there is nothing called Chinese cuisine. I just recount a little anecdote that I read in a book by Pallavi Iyer. The richer and older Chinese persons become, they become more adventurous about the kind of food they eat, the kind of animal they eat, in what condition they eat. Whereas in India, usually as a person becomes richer and older, they become far more parsimonious and far more picky and choosy about what they eat, and they eat very little. They don't experiment too much. So once there was this official banquet going to be held for Indians with China's and with Chinese guests and Chinese with Indian guests. So the discussion that went on, the problem with you Chinese is that you eat everything. And you said the problem with you Indians, you eat nothing. I'll stop.
Growth and economy. Let's get the last question.
Mr. Ramachandran.
I would say that just one line that growth. The issue of growth and economy. I have been reading that Chinese economy will collapse, that there will be an implosion in China for the last 40 years. I'm yet to see it happen. In the same way that people have been saying that China will break up the northeast of India, that also I have been reading for the past 25 years. That has also not happened. I think the Indian state is stronger than that. But I would recommend strongly that looking at the future, there is something that has been brought out called Mandate 25. I don't know how many people in this room have read this. It has been brought out by Trump, by how the US will deal with the rest of the world, beginning with Mexico, the whole of South America, and China, and other countries which stand in the way. So it gives a better picture of where the world is being driven and who is driving it. Lastly, I would recommend to everybody, I came across a very, very interesting thread on Twitter, and this is
And I all along thought that Shastri wouldn't go on Twitter and all the American social media, but would stick only to TikTok.
No, I'm just making a case. The person on Twitter has looked at homelessness in Portland, Oregon in the US and in central Beijing because of a report in the London Economist on homelessness in central Beijing. And she's compared on Kylie, K-Y-L-I-E on train, something is her Twitter handle. She's explored how much of homelessness there isn't there at all in central Beijing and how there has been an exponential rise, almost an explosion in some stages of homelessness in Portland. So here is a country with the world's highest GDP and China is only number 2 as a developing country. So how stories are told, just like I have attempted to retell or redefine how stories are told. She is also deconstructing stories that have been told or retold. I think that would be a way we can get through the thicket and the clutter and see what is the real picture. Sorry.
Yes, Mr. Ramachandran, recently for the last 2 decades, students from Haryana and NCR going good number of in China for medical education and other schools. but most of them they stay back there and marry young Chinese girl. Do you think the way US people relations is growing, this Indo-China relationship is also growing, and to what extent is helping our relationship?
How can I answer that? The way you have asked the question, you have actually answered it.
It's a trick question.
So first is Nayanima, and then Sujata, then.
A wonderful discussion, sir. This is Nayanima Basu from ABP Live. Well, I had also written 2 columns. I'm sure you did not read it. I'm much junior to you, but the fact that, you know, how India should talk to China, I think I wrote that in the month of April. And I also wrote about how we shouldn't have given a space to Nancy Pelosi to come and talk about China like that. So all those 2 columns, I'll share it with you, please have a look. But then I wanted to understand from you, since you covered the current standoff period when it started, do you really see, and since you have this, you know, extensive experience also reporting from China, in the fact that, do you see this current standoff going the way the Sundarong-Chu standoff happened? Because I was recently there in Eastern Ladakh in the Chushul Board, and the situation there seemed really quite worse than what we really think sitting in Delhi. Thank you so much.
Can I repeat the last part of the question?
Would you repeat your question a little?
So the current standoff, do you
The
think,
current standoff. Yes.
is it worse than what we saw during the Sundarong-Chu standoff?
No, first, see, the current standoff will not be over tomorrow or next year. You require political conditions. There are no political conditions. But there are talks going on all the time. Also, a climate has been created where you feel that even to talk about talking to China is to be anti-national. You know? So I think it was quite brave of Vijay Gokhale to say that, what he did, you know. So there are talks going on. Like obviously there have been talks, for instance, for nearly 16 months, if I'm not mistaken, maybe a month more or less, you did not have an ambassador, China did not have an ambassador in India. Then an ambassador has come recently, there was a, so obviously there have been some talk going on somewhere, whether you call it track 2 or deeper than track 2, before these things happen. There are talk going on at that level. There is no perceptible, you know, beyond these small signs. So unless there is a change in political conditions, and you can interpret it in whatever way you want, I don't see any kind of dramatic prospect of dramatic improvement in relations.
Okay, sir. I also wrote in April that they should talk and hugely got trolled for that. So thank you for saying this.
Thank you.
You're not alone. I've been hugely trolled and described as at least 1,000 times as a Chinese agent because of my association with NewsClick.
Okay. If we see, and we do see China largely through the eyes of the West, what do we do when we have no Indian eyes in Beijing or anywhere in China? I mean, how many correspondents do we have? For that matter, how many correspondents do we have in Pakistan, or in Sri Lanka, or in Bangladesh? I mean, it's not just an issue of visas, it's an issue of policy. It's how MEA deals with things, it's how their embassies similarly reciprocate. You know.
Having correspondents, India in China and Chinese in India is, I think, a sine qua non, a precondition for having any kind of a conversation. When I first went to Beijing, I got a fellow who would be most critical of it. When I say fellow, I should call him a fellow. He was my editor and friend and colleague, Gautam Adhikari, in the Times of India. And he was extremely pro-American that one can see in every way. He used to work even with the Endowment for Democracy. So Gautam said, Shastri, writing from China in Indian media is social service. Because there are no political, professional or other capital that you can build up. You're a bit of a pariah when you do that, you know. But this is necessary. But I remember that early in the 50s, we had correspondents in China. I think one of the first Indian correspondents in China was a man who was not remembered for that, was G.K. Reddy. of the Hindu. G.K. Reddy was with Blitz, then he went to Beijing. I think he was also writing for Times of India. When I first came to Delhi, I was introduced to his wife after he passed away. I met G.K. Reddy also by Nikhil Chakravarti. So he said, no, Shastri's daughter. She wanted to put together his writings on China. So I'm sure these things are floating around somewhere. And I remember at one time Times of India had 16 correspondents abroad, maybe early 70s or late 60s, and then Hindu always had a dozen correspondents. But in recent years it's got reduced to London and Washington, and okay.
Most of them are not full-time correspondents,
yes,
they're made stringers. And Sujata, you're absolutely right, this is not just true for China. Where are the Indian correspondents in Bangladesh, in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, in Myanmar? Where are they? I mean, in the name of cutting costs, I mean, look at even the number of people that the Press Trust of India has and how they report. So, looking at China and our neighbors through Western lenses is a huge problem.
There are opportunities in China. I actually know papers and channels where they say China ka invitation, but who will go to China? Hum kyun kisi ko bheje wahan? What is the news there? This is the outlook of many of these editors and owners. Why should somebody go to China? But there have been, the Hindu always sends if somebody has to go. Now, I remember recently on the 70th anniversary of Panchi, there was some young Hindu journalist who'd been sent there for some kind of thing, and he had reported. And actually all of the newspapers reported what Xi Jinping said on Panchida, which is actually an Indian creation. It is our Panchida. We have let the Chinese walk away with it. And reporting Xi Jinping on it, but even that a day later. So that, then at one time, IANS had sent somebody. So when there are opportunities, they are reluctant.
Yes. So I want to ask you one thing, that India's position as far as China is concerned, don't you think it's dictated by the fact that India is not a part of the UN Security Council? You know, the fact that India does not have the same level playing field as China does. And the fact that if the US is speaking to China, they are speaking to China, but they're not speaking to India, that means that we are not that powerful in international parlance, in international affairs, and India certainly deserves a place there. So I don't think that it's, unreasonable for India to expect to be there. And all these kind of antagonisms that we are facing today between India and China are also dictated by the fact that we are not there in places of power, international parlance. What do you say about that?
I don't see India being so down and out as you seem to suggest. I think India is far, far more powerful than China. And even in terms of our armed forces, it is only much in the recent years that China has developed a blue water navy. China didn't have one, then India had. The second thing, I think like the Indian army, the Chinese army is also within the boundaries of China. It is not there like the US army or like NATO forces in other countries. Only maybe some small thing in Djibouti or Seychelles India has, China has. The third thing, which gives India a tremendous advantage, is that China does not have the access that India has to the Anglo-American axis. Okay, this is a very, very powerful axis of power. And because we have access to the Anglo-American axis, the non-Anglo-American powers also, like whether it is France and Russia, of course, traditionally, they have all this. And I think that one way to look at it, like there are many ways. If you ask for Sarballa, if you ask Armin, if you ask Ambassador Nambiar, they all have different ways of how one can view. But I still look at it broadly in the way it was posited by Kishore Mehbubani, that this century will begin and how it end will be seen and decided by how India, China and the US, how which two of the three get to tango. That is what will decide where things go. But if you look at it historically, it's a question of whether you want to look at it 50 years ago. Then we can say, okay, all the wealth, the world's 80% or 70% of its sources are to the east of the Mediterranean. So Russia, India, Iran, China, we are the future. That is one way of looking at it. Another historical way, if the power shifts to this side, then it is also the beginning in immediate terms, slow de-dollarization. It has already begun. People are putting their assets. Even Saudi Arabia has said, we may consider taping a yuan, and that means the slow death of the petrodollar. It may take 25, 50 years to happen, but it might begin. And then you should never forget that I have come across scholars who say that if the power shifts eastwards with all these countries, it means the slow beginning of the reversal of the imperial and colonial age. It began with Columbus' discovery of America. So you have to decide for yourself when you're looking at it in academic terms, where you want to locate and from where you want to tell your story.
I'm just wondering, would anybody else have a reply to that question? Mr. Iyer?
No, I agree with Shastri that that Chinese do want to learn from us and they respect us. This is my personal experience. I do not agree with my friend. When we had entered into WTO before China, China wanted to learn from us how they should negotiate trade-related intellectual property rights agreement or agreement on agriculture. And I had an opportunity to visit them, and I also participated in a meeting in Beijing where the 1,000 deputies were there from various provinces who wanted to discuss WTO. This is one, my experience. Similarly, I went to Chengdu where academics were wanting to discuss. This were not deputies. Academics wanted to learn from us because they knew that India has negotiated, India has. So there is a whole different kind of impression, at least I have, of China, number one. Number two, I want to make a point with regard to science and technology, though Shastri, I learned, I have not read the book, that you have not covered it as yet. But so, when India began its economic reforms, they said China is opening up. We didn't understand what China was doing. Let me be, I can get into the details of that. Our political leadership did not understand it. And I say it across the spectrum. The kind of strategy that they pursued, one can label it in many ways, what it is, etc. But the result is there to see that the way they dealt with state-owned enterprises and public sector and the way we have dealt with them. So our ability to learn from them is partly a result of, because our academic contact also is very weak. Academic to academic contact. I do not know, Poonamji would be able to, Madhuji would be able to tell us better. But I find it, they were so eager, they wanted, even I went from the CSIR, Council of Scientific Industrial Research. They thought I have the ability to strike city to city relationship. They said, why not Chengdu and Delhi be made sister cities? I said, I have no ability to do that. I have no role in that. I cannot even play that role. But it's the Chengdu mayor who's talking like that to us as far as concerned. So there is a whole different perception, at least I have of China. And they did not take all our views. They joined WTO also in a manner, even with harder conditions as far as it's concerned. Similarly, on science and technology and investment, the way they have done, I don't think we have been studying China. The kind of investment they have made in independent innovation and indigenous innovation, the way they gone about dealing about IPR, intellectual property rights, whereas we have done a miserable job on IPRs, and I'm a specialist in that. I don't want to get into the details of that, etc. This is the story I would like to say, that let's increase our academic to academic contact, not only the media presence there, etc. That should be increased, and I hope your book will achieve that, and I would be grateful in case that happens. Thank you.
Thank you. I would just say that China has got into WTO, and among the developing countries, it is the biggest beneficiary of globalization. India has not learned to benefit from globalization the way China has done. If the West, which created and controlled the WTO, wants to change the terms of trade and raise barriers today, it is because of China's success. China's success is not only to stop China, but also a warning to countries like India that your rise will also be dealt with in the same way that China's rise is being dealt with today. We should not ignore that point. And we have a lot to learn from each other, manufacturing from them, and they have a lot to learn from us in terms of services. So I would say there is much to be gained by exchange. Very much.
I'm going to ask Mr. Manishankar Iyer to perhaps partially reply to that question.
Mani, you had a question? No.
The chair wants you to react.
Yes, please, to respond to that last question.
What was the last question? I haven't.
Yes.
Talking about the fact that India's position, the antagonism between India and China is also partly because, is it not also partly because of India not being a part of the UN Security Council? That we do not have a level playing field.
Security Council.
UNSC.
That why? Well, the Security Council is a club of evil.
Yes.
There are 5 powers who happened to defeat Japan and Germany in 1945. And they set up a directorate, not a democratic institution. And because China was allied to America and other countries, whereas we were a colony and therefore were under the British, we were not made a member. But in 1950, by which time the Chinese Revolution had taken place and the communists were in power, and Chiang Kai-shek, who was the ally who had been celebrated in 1945, was no more in power. He was in fact not even in China. He was out in Taiwan, Formosa as it was called there. And the Americans then made a very slimy suggestion that we take China's place. But the clear assumption was that we would then be as allied to the Americans as Chiang Kai-shek had been during the Second World War and subsequently. And Nehru, seeing that this was the game being played by the US, and it was never formally put. It was not formally put to us. It was not formally put to the United Nations. It wasn't formally put to the Security Council. It was just rumored in American circles that America would not be displeased if India were to replace Chiang Kai-shek's China. And I think Nehru had the wisdom which Nehru himself lost in the early 60s to see that the Asian century would only come if India and China were to join hands. And he wrote a brilliant note for cabinet personally, which is effectively an answer to the letter that G.S. Bajpai had drafted for Sardar Patel. And Sardar Patel then sent it to Nehru. Then he fell very ill. So on the 7th of November 1950, Patel had written to Nehru. On the 18th of November, that is 11 days later, Nehru convened a cabinet meeting where the India-China relationship was to be discussed on the basis of a paper prepared by J.N. himself. But unfortunately, Sardar Patel was far too ill to attend that cabinet meeting and in fact died 2 weeks later. So in these circumstances, it was the Nehruvian view, what I call the proto-Nehruvian view, because he then changed, which was very unfortunate. And we have lost that vision of having an Asian century created on the same basis that until the 18th century, until the 18th century, almost everything in the world was led either by China or by India. We were the leaders of world civilization. And then we lost it to the imperial powers. And then we thought we would regain it. But unfortunately, we have not pursued that vision. Instead, we got involved in petty quarrels, and we don't seem to know how to resolve them because we are not giving ourselves the flexibility to understand that our northern borders have always been flexible frontiers. According to the Rig Veda, our northern border lies at Mount Meru, which is in Garhwal. Tell me a single ancient text that includes Aksai Chin. All that came in much, much later, and it was part of the imperial game. And our policy with regard to the borders is part of that imperial game inheritance. And until we break from that colonial mindset and say, let us settle with China where the border lies, let us not forget two things. One, that when Zhou Enlai came to India in April 1960, he came with a broad formula which could have been the basis of a settlement. That in the northeast, they would accept the McMahon line, and in Aksai Chin, we should accept the reality that they were present on the road between Xinjiang and Lhasa. And so let's settle it around there. That was a basis, it was not the formula, it was the basis, but we rejected it. And then in 1962, on the 12th of October 1962, Jawaharlal Nehru, passing through Chennai Airport, which was then called Madras Airport, on his way to Sri Lanka, was asked about the Chinese presence at Thagla Ridge. And he said, I have ordered the Indian army to throw the Chinese out. This was very widely reported at the time. And the Chinese riposted. But they hadn't prepared for the Indian army to not be able to resist them. With the result that when they reached the Brahmaputra, they realized that they could not be supplied during the winter. And so they withdrew. And when they withdrew, I don't think we emphasized this enough. They withdrew even from Tawang, on which they had a pretty strong claim in the name of Tibet. But they withdrew. So if they withdrew then, after having very successfully conquered what was called the Northeast Frontier Agency and is now called Arunachal Pradesh, then I think we ought to have the flexibility to be able to talk to them in a constructive way. And when Rajiv Gandhi went to China in December of 1988, I was with him there. He was expecting that the border problem would be sorted out within the next year or two. They didn't, but we did have peace and tranquility on our border for 35 years. Then we started saying one thing to the Americans and quite another thing to Xi Jinping. And over a period of time, in Wuhan, in Mahabalipuram, in Ahmedabad, he discovered that we were talking out of both sides of our face. And that is what I think led to the problem that we had in 2022. And we are not able to get out of that syndrome. And what I think Aurangzeb certainly, and perhaps even Shastri, are asking is for a change in that syndrome, a change in the mindset where we regard the Chinese as a viable partner in the long term and therefore settle little issues in the short term. When Nehru said that not a blade of grass grows in Aksai Chin, if it belongs to us, why have we never had a district magistrate there? Have we ever had a district magistrate in Aksai Chin? When he said not a blade of grass grows there, my MP from Dehradun, Mahavir Tyagi, was completely bald. He stood up patted his head and said, not a blade of grass grows here. Is it a useless thing? And everyone laughed. So that is, there is a change of mindset required. And our experts, by and large, tend to belong to the current status quo mindset. And we need thinking, fresh thinking, of the kind that Shastri and Paranjoy personify, to be able to find an answer and get on with it. After all, China has borders with 14 countries. With all of them, they were in dispute. They've settled 12. There is one more, 13, which is Bhutan, which wants to settle, and we are stopping them from settling it. And the 14th and last is the great Indian Republic, which does not know how to sort out its border and establish where exactly India lies. So that's the problem. Thank you. I hadn't intended to speak.
Because I always get in trouble with the media.
And you've been recorded.
Oh my God.
Every single word you've said.
I'll be in bad trouble.
Madam Chairman, can I request you to please ask the media? I thought this was a private meeting. I don't realize that the media is here. It will just start a needless controversy to take me back into the doghouse.
Don't worry, China will protect you. Anyways, once again, congratulations, Shastri, for the book, and I have read it. I was there, I was present at the time of release, and today also I got this opportunity to attend this discussion. And I have read it in bits and pieces, but I'm very much wanting to take it to the Hindi readers, because beyond these boundaries, the thing is that in the Indian common people's memory, 1962 is being very much there, and Corona, that thing that it is because of China that the world suffered and the people suffered, that is there, very much there. So if those taboos can be, or those false things can be broken with these real stories, not stories, real facts, and with your experiences which you have narrated, that would be great. So that is one suggestion, that it should come in Hindi and in other regional languages, but at least in Hindi. So Hindi heartland should be taken a little closer to the China. That is one request. Another thing is that I also got the opportunity to visit the China, and I found that the building where I was staying in, there were people from Ethiopia, from Angola, from Tanzania, from various other countries. They were given training in engineering. They were trained. I met people from a country of whose name actually I forgot that it sometime existed, East Timor. There were people from East Timor, so China was, all those were part of the BRI thing, and they were not doing it like they are alleged, that they are grabbing the land in Africa, or they are just using their might to control, the BRI is being used like that. But I found that they were training the local people of those countries, and they were sharing the technology with them, and they were making them, really empowered. So this myth is also something which needs to be broken, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we've come to the end of our session here. Thank you very much to all the panelists and everybody who asked a question. And of course, to Shastri.
Would you like to make some closing remarks, sir? Okay, I'm making some very, very random observations. Thank you so much for your patience. It's very important what Vineet just now said, that Shastri's book should be available in languages other than English. I think it's very important, including Hindi. Shastri himself will acknowledge this. A lot more that can be written, should be written, must be written. Importance of Tibet. I mean, it's that plateau which, in the most water-stressed continent, which is Asia, the major river systems across Asia emanate. I mean, the importance of Tibet itself is a subject where a lot can be said. What Shastri has talked about, manufacturing, service, information technology, digital economy. I mean, this book is important because you get to learn about not just India and China, about Nepal, about Bangladesh and Pakistan, which is important for all students of geopolitics in this country, and I think it is very, very important. It's very easy to stereotype. It's very easy to develop, as you said, these binaries. I remember myself, I asked a Chinese professor, is China communist or capitalist? I mean, I was just trying to provoke him a little bit. And he said, he laughed at me. I think we have a communist polity and a capitalist economy. I said, how can that be? Then he did. What is India? Is it capitalist or communist? I said, no, our first Prime Minister said we have a mixed economy, but some people claim we have a mixed up economy. So it's important to continue engage. I mean, it's not that these isms, and we have the romanticization of the past, Dr. Kotnes, Hyun Sang, I mean, we have to go beyond that because it's become very, very important today, I think, more than anything else. And I want to conclude by one more plug to Shastri. I mean, one thing I really found very, very, very interesting about this, he relates hundreds of anecdotes, but these anecdotes, he kind of links them with the bigger issue, the bigger political, social, economic issue. And he starts with one which is very interesting, bicycles. Once upon a time, Beijing was the city where it has most bicycles anywhere in the world, the largest concentration of bicycles. As people aspired and they owned cars, and then Beijing, thankfully now Beijing is number 2, Delhi is number 1, became the most polluted city in the world in terms of suspended particulate matter and whatever, air quality index. I mean, I'm not talking about the corruption in people's minds. There perhaps we are competing with each other. But the problems that the Chinese administration is trying to, facing, that people go back to bicycles. And something which we in India haven't learned, and something which we need to learn. That's all. Shastri, congratulations.
Thank you.